And so when the global financial crisis finally reached Kenya, donors were pulling their funding. And so we started to think of a solution for people that wouldn't be reliant on handouts or aid, but would rather create employment. And a common statistic is that women tend to reinvest over 90% of their earnings back into their families and communities. And so we knew that we wanted to employ women.
Welcome to Mindful Businesses, presented by Sarani, and I'm your host, Vidya Iyer. In our podcast, we bring to you brands which are mindful in their practices and processes. A mindful business adopts and employs sustainable social, economic, and environmental practices. Today we have with us Kate Holby, co-founder of Ajiri Tea, giving 100% of the profits to create opportunities for women and children. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Vidya.
When was Ajiri Tea founded?
Yeah, so Ajiri Tea was started almost 10 years ago, back in 2009.
And how old were you then?
So I was 19 years old when we started Ajiri Tea, and my sister, Sarah, who's also the co-founder, was 21 years old at the time and living in Kenya.
So it's rather early for you to be thinking of starting a company, let alone just starting a company so far away from home in Africa. What prompted you and Sarah to start Ajiri Tea?
Yeah, so I think that, probably starting a company like this when we are younger had certain advantages, right? So you want the ideal company, right? You want a company that reflects your idealism and optimism with the world at the time. But we started Ajiri Tea really in reaction to events happening around us. So in 2009, as we remember, was the height of the global financial crisis.
Right.
And my sister, Sarah, at the time was volunteering for an NGO in Kenya that was handing out food and drugs to people with HIV and AIDS. And so when the global financial crisis finally reached Kenya, donors were pulling their funding. And so we started to think of a solution for people that wouldn't be reliant on handouts or aid, but would rather create employment. And a common statistic is that women tend to reinvest over 90% of their earnings back into their families and communities. And so we knew that we wanted to employ women. And so really Ajiri Tea Company does three things. We create sustainable employment for women in rural Kenya. We source award-winning tea from small-scale farms in the same region of Western Kenya. And then we sell that tea here in the States and in Australia. And then we send 100% of our profits back to Kenya to pay school fees for orphans. So we are a for-profit company. So we're structured similarly to Newman's Own Company in that we're for-profit, but we donate 100% of our profits to our connected 501c3 Ajiri Foundation.
Let's give the listeners a little bit visual of Kenya. Where exactly is Kenya located in Africa?
Yeah, so Kenya is in East Africa, and the area that we are working in is Western Kenya. So as if you're going out to Lake Victoria, past the Masai Mara, we're working in an area called Kisii. So it's lush, rolling hills, beautiful rolling hills. Everything grows in Kisii. It rains every day. It's really just a beautiful part of Kenya. And it also happens to be an area of Kenya with the largest HIV and AIDS rates in the country because it is such a major trucking route. And so that has left, of course, many orphans in the wake. And so, part of what we do at Ajiri Tea is we also try and provide education for orphans to fill that need.
To talk about the tea, what are the different kinds of teas which are grown in Kisii?
Yeah, so the tea that grows in Kisii, and I can give you kind of a bit of a background of tea in Kenya because I find it quite interesting, is that tea was introduced by the British via India at the turn of the century. And so tea is actually one of Kenya's largest exports. And Kenya is one of the largest producers of black tea in the world.
Wow, I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, and that black tea usually doesn't come to the States. It usually goes to the Middle East, where they like a stronger black tea, right? But in the US haven't really developed a palate for quite strong black teas. We're real coffee drinkers here. But Kenyans themselves also drink tea every day with milk and sugar, and they drink a black tea. And so the tea that we are buying is black tea. It's, black tea and green tea come from the same plant. It's all in how it's processed. Farmers in Kenya, we're sourcing it from a cooperative of 20,000 small-scale farmers who own, on average, a quarter acre to 2 acres of land. And so farmers are all hand-picking each 2 leaves in a bud. And this is kind of, as you can imagine, a lot of work. And it's all grown organically, though we are not certified organic. That is a quite expensive certification to certify 20,000 small-scale farms. The tea, there are no natural pests to tea in Kenya. So our tea is all grown organically. And, you can have a really strong mission. And our mission, as you know, is to create employment for women and to send orphans to school. But you also have to have a high quality product to back up your mission. And we've been really lucky, or we haven't been lucky. In fact, it takes a lot of hard work in that our black tea has won the best black tea 3 years in a row at the World Tea Expo. So we have a very high quality product to back up our mission.
What makes it a high quality product?
It's that the farmers are only picking those top 2 leaves in a bud, and there's very strict quality control within Kenya, within this cooperative in Kisii. And so you're not getting any of that tannic, bitter aftertaste as if a machine was coming along and picking, let's say, the 4 top 2 leaves in a bud or the stalk. So it's really a consistent, strong, smooth flavor. We like to say you can leave the tea bag in your cup, your mug, and it won't have that bitter aftertaste. It will only get stronger.
So what are the different types of teas? They're like Pico tea. I know in Ceylon they have the Pico tea.
Yeah, so this is really closest to an Assam, which was introduced, again, by the British at the turn of the century. And the processing of the tea is a CTC tea. So that means cut, tear, curl. And so it's a very fine and granular tea. So they're literally taking the leaf once it is dried, and they're cutting it, tearing it, and curling it. And so it's not a beautiful long leaf, whole leaf, orthodox tea that you might see in a specialty tea shop. It is really fine, and we sell it loose like that, and we also sell it in tea bags. And, I don't think that our CTC tea, that cut, that tear, that curl, really affects the flavor. Really, it just gives it this strong, strong punch. And that's mainly because historically the way tea has been processed in Kenya. So leaning more towards the CTC process than the whole leaf orthodox process.
You said the Kenyans do drink teas. So is the tea which your cooperatives make, are they sold in the domestic market, or are they primarily for the export market, and then the locals also drink some tea now that they've been introduced to it?
Great question. Kenyans drink tea every day, and this tea particularly, or a tea similar, not perhaps from this cooperative, but from another cooperative. There are 60 of these cooperative type systems that are throughout Kenya. And so I know our students are having tea time every day in school. Our women's groups that we, employ to make our packaging are drinking tea every day. Tea is very much a part of Kenyan culture.
You said the plantations were about a quarter an acre, half an acre plantations. So these are small farmers who grow it literally almost just their backyard. It's not that big. And then they hand pick these leaves, hand it over to the co-ops, and the co-ops, they process the teas, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Tea processing is a more mechanized. It's not something that it's, at least in the present form, cannot be done by hand.
Yes, that's correct. And the farmers, own like I like to say, really not plantations at all, but a quarter acre to 2 acres of land. And there are larger tea estates or plantations in other parts of Kenya, Kericho being one of those regions. But, this area of Kisii kind of, and the size in which I'm telling you, really literally a quarter acre of land kind of speaks to some of the problems in the region, which is, overpopulation. What was once perhaps 60 years ago, 20 acres of land has been divided and divided and divided up amongst family members to now be a quarter acre of land. And that kind of also speaks to the levels of poverty within the region. And what we're trying to address with Ajiri, right, is that women provide farm labor, not just in tea, but in other crops as well. But in sub-Saharan Africa, women own less than 1% of the land. Land has a direct link to opportunity in rural regions, right? A direct link to money. And so with Ajiri Tea, we're employing women, and the women that we have employed have gone on to buy land and buy livestock and use those resources to generate income.
What does Ajiri mean?
Yeah, so we can kind of go back to that since we've touched on the biggest part, right, which helps us fund our model, which is tea. And so kind of working backward, Ajiri means to employ in Swahili. And that's really our primary goal of our company, is to create sustainable employment for women. And so we employ 60 women in this area of rural Western Kenya to hand make each and every label for our tea boxes using dried bark from banana trees. So banana tree bark kind of naturally curls off of a tree, and the women take a razor blade and cut up that banana bark and then glue it onto our own handmade paper, which is made using water hyacinth, an invasive weed on Lake Victoria, and recycled office paper. So it's a really kind of low cost piece of art that is unique and beautiful and environmentally friendly. And we encourage customers to then save those labels that they receive on their tea boxes and reuse them as note cards or bookmarks.
Is this traditional art in this area, or is it something that you and Sarah thought of and taught the women how to?
It is a traditional art, not just amongst this area of Kenya, but really amongst sub-Saharan Africa. And my sister and I, when we were trying to start this company, we wanted something that was relatively low entry for skill sets, right? And for ages for women, right? And so we had found these note cards in a market that were made using dried bark from banana trees. And we said, I'm sure that we could teach people how to make these, specifically women. And so it kind of grew from there. And it was a very, very big learning experience for us and for all of us in the community. We're going on 10 years now in label design and production. And then, we employ women to make the labels, but then we also are trying to create employment for women of all ages. And the labels require a level of dexterity and eyesight. And so we wanted to employ women, in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and perhaps above. And so they make a small twine using recycled banana bark and beads using recycled magazines that can be repurposed as a bracelet that go inside of each package of tea.
Do you and Sarah speak the language? How do you communicate with the women?
Yeah, so there are, I don't know quite off the top of my head how many local languages in Kenya. But in this area, it's Kisi. So the two official languages of Kenya are Kiswahili and English. But in this area, they're speaking Kisi, which is similar enough to Swahili. It's a Bantu language. But we communicate with a mixture of English and Swahili. And we also have two full-time social workers, Difna and Regina, who work with us in Kisi to help communicate with the women.
Ajiri Tea also pays for the orphans to go to school. How do you find these orphans? Is there a selection process? Do the schools recommend them to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that just touching on that, with Ajiri and kind of segueing back to what we were talking about, Ajiri Tea, we try and do two things really. And when we started was, one, tackling an issue that was here and now, or a challenge that was here and now, and that was the employment for women, right? So what can we do to create employment for women who are not highly skilled or not highly trained? What can we do to actually get cash in their hands so that they can go on to start small businesses, improve their lives? And so that was kind of our first immediate goal. And we do that through the sale of tea. And then the secondary goal was tackling this issue of youth unemployment. And, Africa has the youngest population in the world. And young adults, I think in Africa, make up 20% of the population.
When you say young adult, what age group?
Between 15 and 24. Mm-hmm. And, but they account for 60% of the unemployed. The job numbers actually coming out of Kenya are pretty dismal. There were 800,000 jobs created in 2016. 90% of those jobs were in the informal, poorly paid sector, if you will. And so we are trying to find a way to say, we have to address this issue of youth unemployment. If we're addressing the issue of unemployment for women, generally kind of older women, right? How can we really get to the root of the issue of inequality, and how can we address youth unemployment? And I know that this was a concern for the community before we started, because when we were starting to kind of think of where the money could go that we were going to make, we hadn't made yet, we asked the tea farmers and the women, we said, look, we want the money to come back to the community. It only seems right. And they all said, invest in education for orphans, really kind of getting to the root of some of the issues that they were seeing. And so, consistently we have sponsored 30 orphans in school. And how we select them is really a challenge. We're not selecting the students with the highest test scores. We're not selecting the so-called best and the brightest students. We're really selecting the most vulnerable students. So kids who would not go to school without our sponsorship. And these students are coming to us through tea farmers, through local principals, the child welfare office, through church groups, though we are not religiously affiliated. And then we tend to sponsor siblings. It's a real challenge for us too, because, potential is a very hard thing to measure. And as you can imagine, when you're sponsoring vulnerable children, there are, certain challenges, emotional issues come out. And you would think, or you would hope, that once there's food on the table, school uniforms are bought, school books are purchased, everything's set, they're ready to go to school, they're going to do well. And of course, as you know, that's not always the case. It's not always the case with people from privileged backgrounds, right? Kids are kids. And so we really make the commitment to stick with our kids, no matter their test scores. And that takes work. It takes work from the principals. It takes work from our social workers.
It must be a challenge to get them to school, right? The absenteeism rates, if they don't have a stable home life, to make them just show up in school, let alone perform or excel.
Yeah, so the way it kind of works in Kenya is that secondary school is boarding school. And so primary school, while technically free, and there are more day schools, students still have to buy a uniform and books, and so it's not really free. And so we cover that. And then we really focus on sponsoring secondary school students who are all in boarding school in different locations throughout Kisi. And our two social workers, Regina and Difna, escort each student to school, buy all their shopping, and then check in with our students once or twice a term. There are 3 trimesters. And so they really have a great handle on their home life and school life. And that's kind of why we've kept the number to 30 students, is that it's very manageable. We still have these very close connections.
So now Ajiri Tea has been in operation, I want to say, about 10 years?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yep.
How did you get the initial funding? Because you were 19 and your sister was 21, working for an NGO. What was your startup costs and how were you willing to take this risk? Of course, the youth probably helped.
Yeah.
I can conquer the world.
And I think that's a really great question to ask, because I think that a lot of times we ask these questions of startups, or we're thinking these questions, and it's not always straightforward, right? And so my mother had studied in Kenya in the 70s. And so we have had kind of Kenyan connections. And so Kenya was a pretty familiar place to us and our family. And so my mother initially loaned us $20,000 to start a Ajiri Tea company.
And how much have you given back? How much have you given, or rather, how much has Ajiri Tea Foundation given back to the
Mhm.
community in the last 10 years?
Yeah, so we donate. We have donated $20,000 each year, on average for the past 5 years. And while that might not seem like a lot of money, I think that the biggest donations that we are giving is through kind of the time and commitment. So all our overhead expenses, so our salaries, our office space in Kenya, the transport, our salaries of our colleagues, they're all covered through the Ajiri Tea Company. And so any profit is going directly to programming. And so, not included in those costs, if you will, is Regina and Difna going, for example, every day this week to a student's school and spending their time.
This is the second brand that Mindful Business is featuring, which is giving back 100% of their profits to a cause in their mission statement. The other one was the two blind brothers, and they were very young when they started. They are now 29 and 33. So what is inspiring the young people to give back, start businesses which are mindful? What has changed in the environment? I don't see many people in my generation doing this in their 20s. They were out trying to get consulting jobs, or finance jobs.
And
I'm sure you were smart enough to get any of those jobs,
Yeah, I can't really answer that question because I think that for us at least, Sarah and I, and also my mother, we're working so closely in a community, it only seems right that the profits go back to the community. And I like to say, the mission or the cause or whatever you want to call it, it's so rooted in our product. It is our product, right? We're not just selling tea. We're trying to create employment. We're trying to create education. We're trying to disrupt a cycle of poverty, of gender inequality. And so to do that, you have to invest back into the community. And it's not just me and Sarah, my mother, doing this, right? It's our community getting on board in Kenya to make this happen. It's, our women's groups selecting vulnerable students and then following up with them to make sure that they're doing well in school.
Mm-hmm.
It's our Ajiri students that we sponsor, volunteering to come back on their college breaks to mentor and tutor students in the office. We've really created this kind of cycle of change that I just hope keeps on rolling.
So how often do you have to go back, or do Regina and the other social worker take care of most of the social entrepreneurship part of your business?
Yeah, so my sister and I, we'll switch off trips, and we usually go back about 3 to 4 times a year, whether it's, to kind of have those very human connections that make work, or to lead programming. So I know that in a month, we are leading a computer camp for our 30 sponsored students. It's kind of modeled after a summer camp, but they'll be learning how to use computers with a real focus on environmental activism. And so we are, making windmills and solar panels and learning, about climate change and learning about fake news, and hopefully it'll also be fun. And again, this is funded through the sales of Ajiri tea.
Where can one buy your tea?
Yeah, so we have a store locator right on our website. We are sold in larger grocery chains, mainly on the East Coast, but really we love small, independent, local stores.
And you sell online too, on your website too. You can buy.
And we sell online at ajiritea.com.
Thank you, Kate Holby, for all the work you and Sarah do. Thank you so much for being mindful.
Thank you, Vidya, for the great conversation.
If you're a creator of a mindful brand or would like to recommend a mindful brand to be featured on our show, send us a message on our Facebook or Instagram page. We recorded this podcast at Q1067 Lafayette, Indiana. Thank you, Jim Stone, the owner of this radio station. Tatum Gale composed the music for this podcast. This is Vidya Iyer for Mindful Businesses.